Welcome back, and we're into the low points again. I don't want to call it the worst of, but it's basically the worst of series. And we're doing all 31 teams because that's how that works. And with Buffalo, if you're thinking, I feel like we're in the middle of it right now. Yep. Uh-huh. From 2012 till 2019, 8 seasons without Stanley Cup playoffs, and it looks like it would have been 9 this year, depending on what they do with the season and the playoffs. It's a long time. It's a long time to go without playoffs. And the biggest issue for Buffalo right now is next year the year? At what point do Buffalo fans throw their arms up in the air and go, yeah, we're done? At what point are we all Dwayne? Because I kind of feel like I'm Dwayne right now. And again, I wore the Buffalo Slug. We've got the Buffalo Slug here, and I'm wearing this because there's some split on which one's the uglier of the two, which is between this and this. And for me, this was the ugliest, but I figured I can wear both because it's ugly anyways. So even though they don't match at all, it doesn't really matter. Now, when we get into the most losses any goaltender suffered, Ryan Miller had 186 regulation losses. It's a lot. And Ryan Miller was also arguably their second best goaltender behind Hasek. Now, for lost asset, this is where I got stuck on this board. This is where I was looking through, and I'm thinking, okay, so McGillney, no, because they did pretty well in the McGillney trade. Turgeon, no, they did pretty well in that trade as well. The team has been pretty good up until this recent endless rebuild. So to me, and you could maybe point to guys that they couldn't keep when they were having salary problems. I think the fact that they never won a cup during Dominik Hasek's time as the Dominator, where he was setting records with save percentages and goals against averages, shutouts, and he was just so great, and they just could not put a team on the ice that could win a Stanley Cup. I think their lost asset is a cup win for Dominik Hasek. That's it for me. And just cup win in general is one you can come up with for these guys and go, yeah, that's basically it. They've been in the finals twice. And once I get up to Vancouver, we'll have lost assets. That the Canucks, it could be Game 7s of Stanley Cup Finals, but in this case, it felt like Hasek was the best goaltender in the league. It wasn't even close, and they just couldn't close it out in the postseason for him, and it was a shame. Short-term coach Craig Ramsey, 4-15-2 record in the 21 games he coached in 1987, which wasn't that long after he retired. Jim Schoenfeld was their coach, 19-19-5 in 1986. So Jim Schoenfeld, famous for something that happened when he wasn't coaching for Buffalo. He didn't last that long in Buffalo. He played for Buffalo as well. So there is a history of the Buffalo Sabres hiring guys who played for the Buffalo Sabres, Lindy Ruff being the most obvious example, of course. Now, with Not in the Hall, again, I went with top point producers who are not currently active and not in the Hall of Fame, and with wins as well. So Rick Martin is the highest points producer in their history for the Buffalo Sabres that is not in the Hall of Fame. I've done videos on Rick Martin, discussed Rick Martin history videos, and he's part of that French connection, and it was a special time for Buffalo when he was around. Don Edwards is the goaltender with the most wins in their team's history that is also not in the Hall of Fame. Edwards was a good goaltender. I like Don Edwards. He was good. He was fine. Totally understand he's not in the Hall. Not Hall worthy. Is he video worthy? Oh, absolutely. Yes. Now, the longest drought I've talked about, in their first year, they were 24, 39, and 15 with 63 points. That was 70-71. In year 11, which was 80-81, 39, 20, and 21, 99 points. That 21 is ties. So, yeah, 21 ties in a season. And this is why overtime was brought in, because ties were getting ridiculous in the 80s. If a game was tied with 5 minutes left, well, there's your tie. That was it. And Buffalo was pretty good, 99 points overall. They were good in the 80s, but 80-81, they were pretty solid. They went to, as I remember it, I want to say conference finals that year. I'm just spitballing. I didn't actually put that up here. I didn't look that up at the time. I just looked at their regular season numbers. I know they knocked out Vancouver in round 1. We'll go that way. Now, lowest points percentage against any other team versus Edmonton. They have a .424 winning percentage all time. Goals for per game, their lowest number is against Minnesota, 2.28. Now, if you want to counter with, well, yeah, that's the 90s expansion and beyond, so scoring was lower. They've allowed 3.16 against Minnesota. So they haven't played great against Minnesota overall. Goals against per game, most allowed is against Edmonton, 3.53. It'd be interesting to take these goals against per game and just get rid of Gretzky points and see how many teams would still have the Oilers as their goals against per game worst team. The Oilers scored a ton of goals in the 80s. They averaged 5 goals a game during their height of their dynasty. Now, lowest points per game played, minimum of 100 games played. So if you're looking at this and going, hey, where's John Scott? Didn't play 100 games as a Buffalo Sabre. So he is not on this list. Andrew Peters is 0.035. Andrew Peters, not a popular figure outside of Buffalo when he played. Robin Regehr, 0.067, which is surprising because Regehr was a defensive defenseman, but that's really low. Bob Bugner, 0.073. Eric Bolton, 0.99. And Rob Ray, who can call Eric Bolton and go, I scored more than you did, 0.101. Robert Ray, 0.101. Or just Rob Ray. Or, as I call him, Bobby Heenan, because he sounds like Bobby Heenan when he does the color commentary for the Buffalo Sabres. Lowest save percentage, minimum of 50 games played. Jacques Cloutier, 871. And that kind of surprised me. Cloutier was a decent enough goaltender. But again, it's 80s numbers, right? Gary Bromley, same thing, 872. Bob Sauvé. Bob Sauvé, who had some good years, but his save percentage as a Sabre, 877. Tom Barrasso. This is a shocking one. That Tom Barrasso is one of the 4 worst. And this is, again, minimum of 50 games played. And he had an 884. Which shows, again, people talk a lot about the goaltending in the 80s. It was just a very wide open game. Watch 5 minutes of any games from the 80s, and you're going to be like, wow, there really wasn't any clutching and grabbing and hooking and a lot more fighting. But, yeah, they didn't really do the whole defense thing. The defensive part of it was kind of an afterthought for most of the 80s. Although teams that won the Stanley Cup very often were teams that were very adept defensively, which led into things changing in the 90s. But Barrasso was behind some pretty shoddy defense at certain points, as all goaltenders were in the 80s. So 884 for him. And Tom Barrasso is just above Grant Fuhr on this list. I didn't put Fuhr up because I'm trying to keep it to 4 goalies and 5 forwards. But Grant Fuhr had an 886 save percentage with Buffalo, which is surprising because he was actually decent in Buffalo, it felt like, comparatively speaking, with his time in Edmonton. I thought he played pretty well. At a time where Fuhr's kind of bouncing around a bit. He went through Toronto, Buffalo, LA, and then, of course, ends up in St. Louis. But I thought, that was kind of an interesting one. You've got a goaltender in the Hall of Fame in Grant Fuhr with an 886. Barrasso, who you might be able to argue should be in the Hall of Fame with an 884. And again, with Barrasso, and I can do a video on Tom Barrasso because not a big deal. But, yeah, you could make the argument for Barrasso to be in the Hall of Fame. I don't know how strong that argument is, but you can make it. Now, the goalie with the best name, there are numerous ones I could have gone with, but I went with Rocky Farr. Rocky Farr sounds like a Boston resident trying to say Rocky IV, to me. Or just it sounds really movie character-ish. Or maybe somebody from The Sopranos. I know who you need Rocky Farr. Yeah, no, I can make a call. I know a guy. So, for the Buffalo Sabres, the big question that I have with Buffalo in and amongst all of this is, so we did Anaheim. Anaheim's kind of going through their worst period now, but it's not that bad. Arizona, it's been pretty bad for a while, but there's some glimmer of hope. Boston, their worst was in the 60s. And so for Buffalo, I don't know. I don't know where you go with this from here. The one thing I thought was interesting is just looking at their season-by-season roster, and you could point to guys that, again, left as free agents to go elsewhere. Not that there was a lot of cup magic that was had by those players who went elsewhere. But it's been a well-run team that's fallen into some really hard times lately. They've gone through management issues, definitely ownership issues. You could argue they're still having ownership issues. And I guess the big question I have coming out of this is, how long does this run for? How long is it before Jack Eichel is up here as a lost asset because he goes, yeah, no, I can't do this. And he decides he wants to play somewhere else because Buffalo just can't win. And so we're in this interesting time right now in Buffalo's existence where if you've come into hockey and watching hockey over the last decade, you'd look at Buffalo and say, oh, they're terribly run, bad organization, never won a Stanley Cup. And yet for me, with my having watched hockey all the way back to the 80s, man, I remember when they were really good, and they were good every single year. They weren't like elite level and they would get knocked out in the playoffs, but they were still pretty darn good and they'd be in the conversation as one of the top 5 teams in the league. And I just wonder when they get back to that. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about how long it's going to take for these guys to really get back to that level, and what you think it's going to take to get there. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for all your support, especially during this time that we're all living through and we're all getting through. And hey, thanks again for everything. Remember, stay home if you can. Stay as safe as possible. Keep your hands nice and clean. And I will talk to you again soon.